Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Syria was once a proud sovereign country hostile to the designs of stronger Arab nations such as Iraq and Egypt to gain control over it by inserting their military into its territory as part of alliances. But faced with a fight for survival, Syrian President Bashar Assad invited Iranian troops, Hezbollah, and other proxies, and eventually the Russian military to help him gain the upper hand in a civil war. Meanwhile, American forces started operating in other parts of Syria against the Islamic State, and Turkey invaded the north in order to cordon off the Kurdish underground. In recent months, with the war in Ukraine resetting Moscow's focus, there have been changes in the deployments of most foreign forces in Syria. What happened and what are the projected trends? To analyze it, let's turn to Dr. Neil Bohms here in Jerusalem, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us all the way from northern Israel's Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zehavi, who is a CEO and founder of Alma Research and Education Center. Thank you for joining us as well, Colonel.
Yes.
And with me here in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large, host of Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir Oren. Really give us a broader understanding of the complexities of the various deployments in Syria to date.
So it starts with the geography, because Damascus, the capital, is only an hour's drive from the Israeli border of the Golan Heights, a drive by tanks and other weapons, and obviously a very short sortie by aircraft. And while the regime, of course, wants to defend the capital above all other regions, there are further away some districts which fell under the control and then were part of a fight between foreign forces. For instance, on the western part of Syria, the Mediterranean coast, the Russians have their naval and air bases. Further north, you mentioned Turkey. This is where Turkish forces are either inside Syria, or they don't really have to be inside because they can stay on their part of the border and raid and have incursions at will. Then further inland, you had Daesh strongholds, which the Americans have fought. There are still some 900 troops, special forces and others that the United States keeps in Syria. Recently, 2,500 additional American troops were sent to either Iraq, which of course adjoins Syria, or inside Syria. And you have other forces, the various Iranian militias and proxies, and you have Israel with a watchful eye on all of them.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Neil Bohms, I'd like to start with you. Russia has been, of course, the strongest power in Syria, despite the largest deployments being of Iran. When we really focus on the influence or the impact that Russian deployments have in Syria, outside of Latakia and Tartus in particular, it's prevented, on the one hand, if we're looking to the north of Syria, Turkey, from launching a wide-scale operation which President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was declaring time and again as being imminent, yet the Russians stood their ground and the Turks decided to avert a conflict between Turkey and Russia. And on the other hand, Israel has been shy from supporting Ukraine with military hardware because of the Russians' warning that this could impact the deconfliction mechanism between Moscow and Jerusalem, which would ultimately also impact Israel's capacity to protect itself by ensuring its red lines vis-a-vis its arch enemy, the Islamic Republic of Iran. How does Russia's role in Syria continue to impact also now when it is thinning the line, so to speak, on multiple fronts and is more effective in conducting very specific operations, aerial operations particular, but also other operations that have to do with preserving, ultimately, the Assad regime?
Well, you started, Jonathan, by speaking about one of the most important dimensions of the Russian presence, which is air support. The Russians were the ones who entered with 24 airplanes, and in 2015 were able to really tilt the Syrian war and enabled Bashar Assad and the Syrian forces to begin a process that had led to a victory. And I would say that with sort of parenthesis because it's a bit of a pyrrhus victory, but it certainly had tilted the field from led leadership by the rebels and the coalition, supported to some degree by the West, into a Syrian coalition supported by really the Russians and Iranians. The Russians maintain close to 90 different bases in Syria. Some of them are really Russian territory. By the way, I think it's important to zoom out and say that there are documented over 600 foreign bases. The Russians don't have the largest number, but they certainly have some of the most important ones. Certainly the main base, the air base, and the naval bases. And this means that the Russian support and influence is beyond its basis itself and its own interest. It's really its influence on the regime, on the Syrian military, and of course its activities, including in the context of defenses and air defenses. And we remember the various debates about whether the Russians will take a step forward and will implement more sophisticated S-300, S-400 systems, which fortunately was not done yet. Of course, the war in Ukraine had tilted this against some of this balance because the Russians are felt a bit more pushed and they had to focus attention elsewhere. But their influence in Syria remains significant, especially because in relative terms, it does not need a very strong military signature there. It is doing quite a lot with the capabilities they have. And again, with close to 90 different military bases, they're able to control important strategic points, important coordination mechanism with the Syrian military, and make sure that their political influence, their security influence, and their overall influence on the country is kept.
Indeed. Colonel Zavi, I'd like to hear your take with focus on Russian involvement on the Syrian arena.
We've seen kind of a process that happened around the war in Ukraine. I want to explain that because there were a lot of questions of the future of the Russian involvement in Syria after the war in Ukraine started. First, we've seen only reduce of around 1,000 soldiers with the amount of soldiers in Syria. As Amir mentioned, there are 9,000 Russian soldiers in Syria today. Second, we have seen evacuation of some positions in Syria that afterwards were taken by, again, Iranian proxies in the region. And if we speak about the different relationships concerning this issue, what we saw at the eve of the war in Ukraine, we've seen kind of competition between Iran and Russia. Russia put effort to even publish its involvement inside Syria, including civilian involvement and assistance to the population, humanitarian assistance, etc. Competition on areas in Syria under whose influence it's going to be definitely in southern Syria. This ended with the war in Ukraine, and today we understand that everybody, Iran and Russia, kind of agree on a status quo of where are the Russian areas, where are the Iranian areas. South Syria, the area next to the border with Israel, is definitely more and more Iranian areas than Russian areas. We see the Iranian proxies over there. And everybody's happy. There is collaboration in other topics between Russia and Iran. And I think this is kind of the payment of the Russians to Iran in the sense that they agree to kind of a status quo inside Syria.
And even though the Russians are quite particular when it comes to various Syrian government tenders, if it is in the Mediterranean Sea and elsewhere, where the Russians are pushing the Iranians out and are making sure that they gain the minerals and value of their investment in that country. Mr. Oren, I'd like also to hear particularly because the Russians had also various communications with Israel, which started already in 2014 when they entered the arena. At the time, Deputy Chief of General Staff Yair Golan traveled to Moscow, established a deconfliction mechanism, or technically the Russians basically dictated what they expect. The Israelis complied by providing their own interpretation of that, and the reality was formed on the ground. It's been highly effective, where deconfliction allowed, other than 2-3 instances, to avoid a clash in the air. Of course, there were a few times where the Syrian Arab army got frustrated with Israeli aircraft and shot Russian aircraft out of the air rather than the Israeli ones, which were purportedly operating at the time. But when you really look at the arena, what is the Russian compliance vis-a-vis Israel when we're talking about the 60 kilometers versus the 80 kilometers buffer, where Israel expected no Iranian forces on its northern border, but the Russians, of course, interpret the Israeli demand or expectation a bit differently.
So, from what people in the know say, and we have to take their word for it, there is no warmth in the relationship. It's not as if two adversaries, not to say friends and allies, two adversaries have communications, as was the case in the mixed armistice commissions, even between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, before the Six-Day War. There was never any warmth between Israel and Syria on such commissions. There is a hotline in the Israeli operations center. There is another one in Khamimim, in the Russian air base. One officer picks up the headset, calls the other, mostly it's the Israeli calling the Russian to say that something is in the offing, gives them the general vicinity, of course, so that the Syrians will not be alerted. And then the Israeli gets from the Russian a very curt reply, such as yes, not even a thank you, and this is it. Each side lives with it. Up to now, the Israelis have been more careful to know that there are no Russian aircraft in the air at the time.
Well, the Russians also inform Israel when they conduct joint air maneuvers together with the Syrian army along the border.
Yes, but if we leave Israel aside for a moment, Syria is the one place where Russians and Americans almost clash. The Americans, of course, are not flying over Ukraine, but they do fly, at least drones, over Syria. And the Russians very aggressively fly near or even at the drones. And there are incidents. Up to now, no one has been killed, but it could be a flashpoint because while the world has shifted its focus from the Middle East to Europe, there are still quite some areas of conflict where superpower confrontation could start in.
And we'll touch more on this matter in a moment, since Operation Inherent Resolve is quite the substantive deployment, despite, as you mentioned initially, the 950 U.S. troops in Syria operating. But I'd like to ask Dr. Bohms with regard to Iran. We see the Fatimiyun brigades. We see Pakistani brigades also operating alongside them. We see other members of Kata'ib Hezbollah and the Hashd Shabi, or Popular Mobilization Forces, sending in various battalions, or I don't know what substantive size they actually consist of, but various brigades, let's say, that are then being sent to operate alongside the Assad regime, alongside Hezbollah and other Shiite militias operating under the command of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, which receives its direct policy and criteria of the Ayatollah regime in Tehran. How is that currently being handled, and what is actually that force consisting of?
Well, just to begin with, just to add that the Iranians have done even more by trying to create local forces, the national defense forces, the local defense forces, Syrian Shia militias, and they've done that to consolidate either Shia supporters and sometimes non-Shia supporters in paramilitary structures to enable them to increase their influence on the ground. And if the Russians were able to consolidate their influence really using air power and using their planes to tilt the battlefield, the Iranians were able to really move from the ground. They have built bases in Syria, over 120 Iranian bases. But also, the different reports map a similar number of bases that are connected to Hezbollah and to other proxies, which are again Iranian influence or Iranian control, but still kind of almost semi-independent and not controlled by the Syrian military. And again, this if we can zoom out on the Syrian map, you see that the Syrian states of the Assad, the Syria Arab Republic under Assad, has a control of less than 2/3 of the territory of the country. And within this 2/3 of the territory of the country, there are close to 500 security and military installations that are not controlled directly by the Syrian military, which in turn is also heavily influenced by Russian, as we spoke before, and also very much by Iranian influence. So the strength of Iran in Syria is by both the militias that they brought from the outside, the local forces that they've created, they then often given better salaries than others, and by the creation of these bases and presence that really have effective control in significant parts of Syria, by the fact that the local force, the local security force, the local really militia is Iranian dominated.
Indeed. Colonel Zavi, your take on this?
I just want to give specific examples to what Nir said. We published a report about Imam Hussein Brigade. Newsweek addressed that last month, talk about kind of an umbrella organization to many players and members of Iranian militias in Syria. And we took that and we started to research. And what we actually find out is that Imam Hussein Brigade in the past few years had become part of Division 4 of Maher al-Assad, who is the brother of the Syrian president. I think this is one step forward from just having militias in Syria. It means that Iran is trying to create platforms of influence and involvement inside the Syrian army. And the commanders of this Imam Hussein Brigade are saying in interviews very clearly that they are getting the salaries, the ammunition, the training from Division 4. You see this in their Facebook page. They define themselves as the SEALs of Division 4, meaning that they became part of that. Now, we've seen this happening in Iraq as well with Khazali, Hashd Sha'abi, and the Iraqi army. And now we've seen the same pattern happening here in Syria. So this is like for the involvement of Iran. Another anecdote is about the Russians, specifically around Iranian connections with the Russians. Very mysteriously, we have seen a plane, that Iranian plane came from Iran 2 months ago, landed in Hamimim, in a Russian military base in Syria. This is a plane that in the past we've seen the airplane that is involved in the smuggling of weapons from Iran into Syria, usually landing elsewhere, Aleppo, Damascus, and all of a sudden it landed in Hamimim. It raised a lot of questions here. We don't know exactly why, what it was bringing, if ever. But again, it's definitely, if it is bringing Iranian weapons into Syria, which we don't know, it's another step forward to completely new situation in Syria.
Indeed, this could, of course, put Israel and Iran, and Russia on a course of collision, of course, with American involvement for that matter. But let's move forward because we do not have very much time, and this is a very important topic. Operation Inherent Resolve. It's as part of a U.S.-led coalition. Everybody speaks about the American special operators. Nobody speaks about the other Western operators because of its classified nature. But we have quite the specific operation taking place there against particularly the Islamic State, but also positioned or postured in very strategic places that are thwarting, challenging Iran's capacity to maneuver, the Russian capacity to maneuver, as well as the Syrian for that matter.
So you are probably referring to Bukamal on the eastern part of Syria and Tanef on the southeastern part, because
Hasaka, of course.
yes. But when you mention inherent resolve against Daesh, usually wars were ended by unconditional surrender or armistice talks, and then everybody shook hands and went home, and the prisoners of war have been released or exchanged. The problem with Daesh is that the prisoners are still a problem. There are thousands of them in prison camps. Their families are also camping nearby. Nobody knows what to do with them. You can't release them. They will regroup. You can't keep them on. It's costly, and obviously they are getting indoctrinated, and perhaps they study the art of subversion even more. And usually we sweep it under the rug, but this could return as quite a problem for the Americans and others.
Indeed. Well, nonetheless, we do see the Americans operating there, and there are three schools of thought in the U.S. National Security Council. The one, of course, has to do with allowing Turkey to take a more active role in the arena. Of course, the Turks were already asked by the Americans in the past; they refused. Now the equation has somewhat changed, also with the appointment of Ibrahim Kalin as the National Security Advisor, or the head of MIT for that matter, as well as the various people operating there. It seems like that they're more active on the Syrian front, but nonetheless, the second school of thought is that the Americans should take matters to their own hands and be more vigorous in deployments and things like that. Of course, not under the current administration, which seems to be quite passive on making any reaction. But tell me, Dr. Bohms, how do you see this evolve at this stage?
I think the United States, for the last few years, have been taking a somewhat consistent approach in the context of disengaging from the more active mode of operation in the region. This is something that had pushed the actors in the region to take leadership and become more assertive themselves. Perhaps we're not always in approval of some of these measures, including, let's say, the Turkish invasion into Syria. But part of that was part of the understanding that the region needs to be more assertive, and there's not going to be a big uncle from across the Atlantic that will save the day. And as a part of the new reality in the Middle East, now we are beginning to see that some of these players are beginning to consolidate their relationship with each other, and that some of the conflicts inside the Middle East are being brought into a more sort of peaceful dimension, and that there's better conversations between the different allies, the Gulf, Turkey, the disputes, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. We have an arena where people are beginning to speak with each other, and part of that was also a recognition that Syria needs to come back into the Arab League, and that the regional partners it needs to find a way to use diplomatic means to solve some of the problem. That is still early to see if that's going to sort the ongoing conflicts in Syria on the ground that are continuing. By the way, there were recent attacks of ISIS. There were recent tackles between Russian and American drones just as recently as last week. The arenas are still active, but it appears that if anything is going to move, it's not because of the deepening American involvement, but because the partners, the stakeholder, will try to reach stability. There is an interest of deconfliction that may eventually influence the Syrian arena at large, or at least some parts of it, because again, Syria is de facto divided.
Colonel Zavi, you have 30 seconds. Where are we heading from here? Are you expecting to see more deployments, or is there going to be a breakaway?
I think it's a big question. What's the price of deconfliction? The Americans, and I think all players in Syria today, are interested in the status quo as was created. But there is a price to this status quo, because at the same time, players that are not that comfortable for Israelis and Americans are developing. Americans view ISIS much more of a threat than Iran. Fine, if Americans will leave Syria, it will fall in the hands of radical ideologies again, ISIS and Iran at the same time. And I think this is important to bear in mind.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Nir Bohms, Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve Sarit Zahavi, and Mr. Amir Oren for being part of today's panel. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until next time, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.